Dear ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome to this webinar on the Media for Democracy Monitor 2021, organized by the Euromedia Research Group in collaboration with the Dutch Journalism Fund and the Institute for Media Studies at KU Leuven. I'm Leen. I'm a professor at Communication Science at that Institute for Media Studies, and I'm your host for this webinar. First of all, what is the 2021 Media for Democracy Monitor? It's an international study of 18 mature democracies carried out in the first half of 2020. That is immediately before or during the early stages of the pandemic. And the monitor is aimed at mapping the overall performance of leading news media. In more concrete terms, it's an international data collection monitoring the conditions under which leading news media can fulfill their information, their forum, and their watchdog functions. In each of these 18 participating countries, a research team has collected data. Data related to topics such as the availability of news media platforms, the diversity of the news supply, the degree of media concentration, the independence also of journalists, and the way they see themselves as watchdogs. Until now, the Media for Democracy Monitor is primarily known as an academic instrument, and it's only known mostly in academic circles. Our aim today is exactly to bring this 2021 edition to the attention of a broader audience, which is why this webinar also marks the official launch of the 2021 Monitor. Since the previous edition in 2011, the methodology has been revised somewhat to reflect exactly the changing conditions of the news media in a decade characterized by digital transformation, with new challenges for journalists and new possibilities. Some new indicators were added concerning gender equality, misinformation campaigns, threat, and harassment of journalists. All of these topics will be touched, although concisely, touched upon in this webinar. So what's on the program today? The methodology, first of all, will be explained, as well as the main findings. In addition, the overall performance of leading news media in one country, the Netherlands, will be looked into. Furthermore, three areas of concern that are highly characteristic for journalistic practices nowadays will be discussed. First of all, we'll talk about the journalistic profession becoming more precarious. We'll talk about coping with misinformation. How do the newsrooms do that? And also about coping with growing online intimidation and harassment. 5 researchers from the Media for Democracy Monitor from the team will present these topics. And I invite you, because we're numerous today, to post your questions in the chat, which I will monitor closely, and time allowing, I will present to our panelists after the presentation. So we'll have a debate on these questions. Let us now start with Professor Josef Trappel, the initiator, the inspirer of the Media for Democracy Monitor. He is a professor of media policy and media economics and the head of the Department for Communication Studies in Salzburg University, Austria. He will give us a brief overview of the monitor's methodology and an insight into the results of the comparative analysis. Josef, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Leen. It is a great pleasure and honor to be with you this afternoon. And it's a lot of satisfaction, actually, that we can launch the Media for Democracy Monitor 2021 today with so many friends and so many journalists attending this meeting. And I think it shows, and your interest actually shows that this research project is relevant, it's important, and it is about media and democracy, meaning that both items, I think, are of highly contested interest over the last couple of weeks and months and years. So I think we are on the right track with our topic here. So let me briefly summarize the findings, the main findings of the 2021 edition of the Media for Democracy Monitor. But before I do so, I would like to show you the cover of the forthcoming book, which is available from May onwards with our great publisher Nordicom, who is going to publish this book open access. That means you can even have a view to the book free and open. And this is an important part of our exercise, because we believe that science, social science, communication studies should be free and open available. And that is important for us. So many thanks to Nordicom for giving us the possibility of having this kind of online and freely available volume. There will be actually 2 volumes, as you can see. One volume is going to contain those countries which have been there 10 years ago. So one volume is a longitudinal comparison, and the other volume, volume 2, contains those countries which participate for the first time this year in the Media for Democracy Monitor. But now let me continue with the findings. First of all, on the positive side, we have important, let's say, findings to record or to deliver. First of all, it's a very positive sign that there is, in all 18 countries, a very high interest in news still. So we consider that the news media have been successful in raising attention. So their products are available, they are available at affordable prices. And our empirical research has been conducted, as Leen has said, before the pandemic. So in that sense, we know from other studies that now, after or during the pandemic, interest for news has been rising, actually. So it's even more important than before. So news are a very important part of scientific or social communication, actually. So democracy here says, thank you very much. Furthermore, the leading news media are and became highly competent in investigative reporting. So that's also an interesting finding, because we have seen that a number of transnational networks for investigative journalism have been created. They become part of the professional identity all over the place. And there are striking examples of how well these networks work. IGIC is one of them, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. And we have seen that almost all over the 18 countries, that investigative reporting became more important during this decade, which we call the decade of digitalization. The third positive findings is that the media respect the code of ethics at the national level. So they incorporate these codes into their day-to-day routines. That doesn't mean that in every newsroom session, these codes are again repeated, but it seems that journalists do respect them and they honor this code of ethics. So thank you, says democracy. However, where there is light, there is also some kind of shadow. Here again, we have the following findings across the board, across the 18 countries participating. And the first one, and the most striking result actually, is in this global comparative study that we still have unacceptable levels of discrimination of women, in particular in reporting, regardless of the country, regardless of the type of media. Women are underrepresented in media content, and they are underrepresented in leading positions in media companies. That means the glass ceiling still exists, and we have come across the glass ceiling in almost all of our countries. In this respect, I'd like to go one step deeper. Women do appear on screens in all of these countries, but in much smaller numbers than men, and in different roles. It is no stereotype. It is confirmed by our research. Women are present in soft items of the news, and much less in politics and economics. For the 9 countries where we did the longitudinal exercise here, we see some improvement in some of these indicators. So there is some light at the end of the tunnel here. And if we are looking for role models, then we need to look to Sweden and to Denmark. Democracy says, oh my dear. The second finding is not surprising, and it concerns media concentration ownership. Such concentration persists and increases. Early optimists in the digital age, and those notoriously refusing reality, still believe that digitalization is going to solve the problem of media concentration. This is, of course, not the case. Media concentration is higher than ever, and it is highest in digital communication. In other words, national oligopolies have transformed and have been supplemented by global monopolies. Democracy says, how can you dare? Third and final, journalistic jobs became precarious over time. In not a single country, journalists can count on an uninterrupted employment over a long time. They must envision that they have to change jobs even against their will, or that they go into temporarily unemployment even. Again, this affects not only the so-called poorer countries, but this is prevalent along our sample. Let me close my short speech here by explaining briefly the methodology. Based actually on a root concept of democracy, we developed 30 indicators in 3 dimensions. In each participating country, a team of social scientists collected evidence for each indicator. And I had a look just before this meeting. We had no less than 56 social scientists working on this project in the 18 countries, which is, I find, an impressive number. The MDM actually follows an integrated approach, meaning that all secondary sources which are useful have been exploited, and we have conducted interviews with journalists and editors-in-chief. And again, I counted them. There are more than 100 personal interviews which have been conducted during this exercise. And we have been talking with representatives of journalistic unions as well to solidify our findings. Finally, teams have been grading the achievement for each indicator. So we transformed the qualitative study into a quantitative measurement, and each indicator has been graded with a maximum of 3 points, meaning that 30 indicators deliver a maximum of 90 points. And what I'm going to show you here is how the countries have performed. You can see here that we have basically 4 groups of countries. The first group of countries, Denmark, Finland, Sweden, and the UK, they reached around 80% of the maximum scores. The group 2 contains Canada, Germany, and the Netherlands. They reached about 70%, and the largest group, as you can see here, are the countries Austria, Belgium, Iceland, Italy, Portugal, South Korea, and Switzerland. They reached about 60% of the maximum points. And finally, the last group, number 4, contains Australia, Chile, Greece, and Hong Kong, and they achieved about 50% of the points available. So with that little short overview, I thank you for your attention, and I return the floor to Leen for her further conduct of the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Josef, for setting out the methodology and also introducing us to the clustering of the countries. Of course, this is not a beauty contest, so to speak, country by country, but the clusters are important. And I'm sure in the debate we'll be having possibilities to explain a little further how come certain countries are in this or that cluster. And the second presentation will be by Hanne Vandenberghe, who will focus now on some of the most important insights as far as the Netherlands goes. And the Netherlands is an interesting case because it's one of the 9 of the 18 countries, one of the 9 countries that we have a comparative, a longitudinal, so to speak, look of. So we have data from 2011 and data from 2021. So here we can look at the situation 10 years ago and look at what has improved and what has gotten worse. Hanne is a postdoctoral researcher, a colleague of mine, and a lecturer at the Institute for Media Studies at the University of Leuven. And she, in her PhD, dealt with news diversity. And together, the two of us, we ran the research for the Netherlands. Hanne, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Leen. Dear everyone, it is my great pleasure to present today some general and remarkable results of the Dutch case. As the Dutch Journalism Fund is supporting this project, we are delighted to showcase the results of the Netherlands. Unfortunately, no 12 points to the Netherlands as in the Eurovision Song Contest in 2019, although the Netherlands scored in a second tier cluster based on the MDM methodology that Josef Trappel just briefly explained. The Netherlands obtained 73% of the maximum scores on the 30 indicators and ended in the charts in the 5th position together with Germany. Only Sweden, Denmark, United Kingdom and Finland did better than the Netherlands. The chart shows also that there is a small decrease in the scoring results between 2011 and 2021. The dimensions freedom and equality declined over time, but we notice an increase of the journalist's watchdog function in the control dimension. One of the reasons the freedom dimension declined is that the average daily reach of traditional established news media has declined in the last decade, resulting in a drop by 1 point on this indicator on news media consumption. In line with the international trends, youngsters are following less traditional news media, and especially newspapers have suffered a dramatic decline in the amount of readers. But without wanting to focus only on the negative aspects, there is progress when it comes to internal rules for practice of newsroom democracy. Established news media platforms have an editorial statute, resulting, for instance, in a representation of journalists via a newsroom council that influenced decisions such as hiring an editor-in-chief. Overall, the Dutch journalists experience an open debate culture in the newsrooms. And last but not least, although the Netherlands is a medium risk country in the case of intimidation and harassment of journalists, the country scores high on the protection of journalists, for instance, due to the website persveilig.nl. In the last presentation, Alice Baroni will further elaborate on this issue. And move on to the dimension equality. There, I want to draw your attention to one of the main issues that also Josef Trappel already mentioned, but also is the case for the Netherlands. And that's the level of media ownership, and especially media ownership concentration at a national level. That is remarkably high and is higher in 2021 compared to 2011. The television and radio market is dominated by the public service broadcaster NPO and Talpa network, and the newspaper market is dominated by 2 Flemish players, Mediahuis and DPG Media. Looking to the final dimension, control, also a positive story, the training opportunity, although they depend on the news medium, overall journalists are able to professionalize themselves. Institutes such as the Dutch Association of Journalists, the NVA, and the Association of Investigative Journalists, the VVOJ, offer training courses, and also media companies itself have their own training academies. And then I want to conclude this brief overview of the Dutch case. Dutch journalists are able to play their watchdog functions for democracy quite well. However, we distinguish three main problem areas. And the first one is the high media ownership concentration that I already mentioned earlier. There's an increased concern in the last decade on these levels of media ownership concentration, but it's currently not an acute risk. News brands still retain differentiation content catering to different audiences. However, the fact that DPG Media have dismantled the regional newspapers in the Netherlands, and that in Flanders, DPG Media has clustered television, newspaper, and magazine newsrooms in one integrated newsroom that's located in Antwerp, reinforces the concern among the Dutch interviewed journalists and experts on this issue. Secondly, there was also a remarkable result. There is a lack of access to government data. The Public Access Act procedure was strongly being criticized by the interviewees as being needlessly complicated and time-consuming. It was also the case 10 years ago, but now the fact that the law was suspended during the COVID-19 pandemic highlighted this issue even more strongly. And finally, the third problem area is the fact that permanent contracts are being exchanged for freelance deals, which entails very limited job security. Also what Josef Trappel already mentioned as one of the general limitations in the findings. And also Christian Ruggiero will present in his presentation about journalistic work, the fierce battles in the rate space to freelancers in the Netherlands. The increased ownership concentration even reinforced this problem because it makes payment negotiations less easy due to the less players on the market. The COVID-19 crisis had already a negative impact during our round of interviews for freelance journalists working for the Netherlands, for the Telegraaf, or BNR Nieuwsradio. We will certainly monitor further long-term effects on this crisis on the democratic well-functioning of journalism. And then for now, I thank you for your attention, and please feel free to add questions in the chat room.
Thank you, Hanne. Meanwhile, we have also the correct link to the euromediagroup.org, where you can take a look at your own country or countries of your interest. This will be the only country report that, of course, in a very concise way, we will be presenting to you. Now we go on to a more thematic approach across the different newsrooms in the countries under study. And we look at the three areas of concern that we identified in our Media for Democracy Monitor exercise. The first one, which will be introduced by Christian Ruggiero, is the job security of journalists, which is under pressure in the countries under study. Christian Ruggiero is an associate professor at the Department of Communication and Social Research at the Sapienza University of Rome. His main research concerns political communication, with particular attention to the role of the media in electoral campaigns, and also on sociology of journalism, with a particular focus on the evolution of journalists' profession and the interplay between the legacy media and social media. Christian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and welcome to all of the colleagues that are hearing us. Now, the topic of job security has in the MDM framework a specific indicator that is C4 indicator named job security, and that has a specific link with the theoretical framework Professor Trappel presented you, that you can see here in the slide. We worked also on other two indicators that are about professionalization of journalists and professional training, since not only all these indicators have to do with job security, but we can find very similar dynamics of inequality, both in the entry into professional journalism and in the way a journalist can keep update in his or her work. Now, looking at the country ranking that comes out from our MDM 2021 data, we have a concentration of countries on those scoring 2 and those scoring 1 on the job security indicator. Only one country, that is Chile, ranks 0, and we have no country ranking 3. But if at a first glance, this slide can lead us to say that a geographically based model can help, like that of Helena Mancini, can be sufficient to understand what is going on in European and global journalism, there is something more that we have to look at. First of all, we have to work on the framework to understand if we have this country scoring 0, because there is something that we have to do a little better to understand contexts that are not European ones, and they're very interesting part of the MDM 2021 research. We have many countries not in the traditional models of journalism. Then we have to go a little deeper on this data, and we can find a couple of important dimensions of inequality, one regarding age and the other regarding the typology of contracts that are used in the different countries for journalistic profession. We can find in these dimensions the same starting point, and the starting point is that there is a turnover in the newsrooms. Turnover in the newsrooms is something unavoidable, also because younger journalists have different skills from more experienced ones. Skills linked with the multimedia languages, with the digital languages, and so on. But where in some countries, those that are high ranking, this is a threat for older journalists. And there is the tendency to include newer journalists at the same level. The risk is, and that happens particularly in the lower grade countries, that younger journalists are hired not so much for their skills, but because they are cheaper than experienced journalists. Then the dimension of the contracts that are used in the journalistic work. There is a common trend to fixed-term contracts, to the use of freelancers, but there is a very different way to understand what a freelance is. There are countries, such as the Netherlands, where there are fierce battles to have the freelancers on the same pay level than other journalists. There are countries, unfortunately, like Italy, where there is a huge use of young and not recognized journalists. Then the leader of our trade union defined information writers. So that these are dimensions that go deeper in the data than a first glance explanation that might be only linked to the geographical dimension, for example. What we try to do with this research, what we have to do in our next step, what we are going to do in the other book we are going to publish after that with the country reports, I really hope we are going to do, looking at MDM 2031, is to understand how these dimensions of inequality, especially linked to journalism, job security, but also to other critical dimensions we found, can be problematized to better understand how effectively journalism can survive the digital transformation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christian. So we have a second thematic presentation today, and this area of concern deals with the so-called information disorders as a result of an increasingly digitally connected world. So we wonder, how do journalists contribute to the countering of online misinformation? How do journalists accept online misinformation as a challenge or as day-to-day business in their work? And are there any different answers that were given in the interviews to these questions, depending on where we looked? So these questions will be dealt with by Jón Gunnar Ólafsson, who is a postdoctoral researcher in the Faculty of Political Science at the University of Iceland. He completed his PhD in Media and Communications from Goldsmiths, University of London, and his research interests include political communication in small states, misinformation, and the impact social media have on political news coverage. Jón, you can go ahead.
Thank you so much. First of all, I'd just like to say it's great to be with you all here today. And when COVID-19 is over, I'm very much looking forward to inviting you all to come to see our volcano, which is very much spewing lava every day. So I'm sure you've seen that on the news. So what I want to talk about here today is how journalists deal with misinformation. And the way I'm going to present this is I'm going to focus on a chapter that I've been working on with actually 8 other researchers who were working in the Media for Democracy Monitor. And so Josef has already explained sort of the data collection, but we primarily are using a lot of the interviews for this. And I was the one who did all the interviews here in Iceland, and actually used to work as a journalist, but sort of before social media became a big thing. So it's interesting for me to sort of reflect on what's going on since then. But so one of the things that we discuss in the chapter is that academic work on misinformation, online misinformation, has so far focused heavily on social media and alternative media and sort of hyper-partisan media. And, you know, we've seen this a lot in the news in relation to elections and so forth. What's really, really interesting, I think, is that the Media for Democracy Monitor 2020, it included an indicator on how news media protect and defend their content against online misinformation. And this is actually the first comparative analysis of how newsrooms around the world view and address online misinformation. So this is really cutting edge research that you can read about soon in more detail when we publish this, but I want to give you some sort of sneak peeks into this. I find this really, really interesting, and it's really great to add this comparative aspect to the research. So one of the things that we found is that definitely not all the journalists we interviewed perceive online misinformation necessarily to be a problem. And a lot of them also talked about misinformation obviously not being a new thing. So that's one of the reasons why it's important to highlight the online emphasis here. And there was commonly actually little concern in some countries, and I have 3 here on the slide: Iceland, Austria, and Italy. And just in relation to the Icelandic case, since I did all the interviews here, one of the things that the journalists highlighted was the small size of the country. It's so easy to reach everyone here and to go to the original source. So there's obviously a lot of sort of country-specific factors that we do need to bring into this. But then we did also see little concern also in some of the bigger countries like Italy. So, you know, the journalists did say that, you know, it is an issue, obviously, but not necessarily of grave concern. But then in other countries, there was a lot of discussion of sort of heightened awareness, particularly during key events like protests and elections. And we have examples from the interviews, for example, from Hong Kong, Canada, and Chile. And so this is the sort of awareness aspect. But then in terms of the strategies and what the journalists talked about there, and sort of how do you deal with online misinformation? Definitely the by far most common point discussed in the interviews simply concerned rigorous journalistic work. So what the journalist said that, you know, it's business as usual. We have all these journalistic skills, but we just need to do our job even better than before. But one of the problems with this is that most journalists are dealing with increased resource constraints. So there's fewer journalists who need to do more work, but at the same time, they talk about in the interviews that they actually need to be more thorough. So this is an equation that doesn't really add up. If you have less time, you need to do more, but you also need to be more thorough. So this is an issue that is of a grave concern in the interviews that we talked about, and I think something that we definitely need to address moving forward. And one of the other points that was definitely mentioned a lot was how you sort of adapt your journalistic skills to suit the digital era. You know, obviously a lot of journalists are using social media content as sources. So how do you use it as a source? How do you do it differently, for example, when you have someone like a politician versus someone from the general public and so forth? And there was also quite a lot of doubt or sort of intrigue, but doubt about technological solutions and sort of hadn't really been necessarily focused too much on. So that by far the key point was definitely focused on the skills of the individual journalists. And then just to sort of conclude with some key points that definitely there's increased awareness, but this is not really translated into a coherent approach in newsrooms around the world. So there's different ways that journalists are dealing with this. But the traditional journalistic skills were emphasized. But one thing, and sort of, since we're talking about the project more generally here as well, because this is the first time that this indicator was added, and I think it's great that it was, we were mainly asking them about content and the effect on content. But what came up in a lot of the interviews was society more generally and sort of the media's role in educating the public about online misinformation through media literacy and so forth. So I definitely think moving forward, we need more research on this. And just to highlight, because I know we don't have a lot of, there's a lot of people here who are not in academia, the terms we're using here, misinformation, is a broader term than what you often hear as well, which is called disinformation. So misinformation is the spreading of false or misleading information regardless of intent. So it's not necessarily on purpose, whilst disinformation is when this type of information is spread with intent. And this is a key difference, because for journalists, often they might not be intentionally putting forth some information that is in fact false. So this is a key sort of terminology issue that we go over in the chapter as well. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I just see also in the chat that we have now exactly the link here. For those of you who haven't found it yet, it's euromediagroup.org/MDM/reports/ So there you can take a look also maybe in preparation for your questions. So another disturbing trend that we found in our democracy, Media for Democracy monitoring exercise was the harassments, the increasing smear campaigns, the death threats, and sometimes with fatal effect that journalists are facing. Just think about the recent murder of a prominent crime journalist in Athens, shot dead on his way home from work, and work was Star Television, commercial television in Greece. So intimidation and harassment will be the topic of the presentation of our last speaker before the debate, Alice Baroni. And Alice is a Seal of Excellence Research Fellow at the Department of Political Science, Law and International Studies at the University of Padova in Italy. And she's exploring online and offline harassment and abuse of women journalists and also photojournalists in a comparative context. Alice, you can start your presentation, please.
Sorry, my voice has disappeared. Thank you so much, Leen. It's a great pleasure and honor to participate in this webinar and to present the core findings on the indicator protection of journalists against online harassment in the 18 MDM participating countries. Here I will present the nexus between the magnitude of the problem in the MDM countries and the protection mechanisms adopted at the level of leading news media organizations and journalist professional associations. And could you change that? Thank you so much. Similar to Ian, I will present a chapter that I wrote in collaboration with Leen and Janet Lowe, and we used the country reports and the interviews to write up the article, and we divided the countries in 3 categories: low-risk countries with harassment on the rise, medium-risk countries, and high-risk countries. The magnitude of the problem differs from country to country, and so the protection mechanisms to address different forms of violence against journalists. Due to time constraints, I will just point out some information about particular countries. Under low-risk countries in Austria, Iceland, Portugal, and Switzerland, cases of harassment are rare or unknown, and journalists can rely on legal support and protection of their employers when insults occur. On the other hand, harassment, particularly online, is on the rise in countries such as Denmark, Belgium, Finland, and Sweden. Under medium-risk countries, in the European context, in Germany, hate speech against journalists is increasingly rapidly, and shitstorms on Twitter has become a part of journalists' daily routines. Likewise, Dutch journalists are confronted with harassment, shitstorms, or insults, especially online. Over the last years, organized crime groups are threatening crime reporters, and during coronavirus pandemic, physical attacks against journalists and hostility towards the press are on the rise in the Netherlands. As for high-risk countries, online harassment has become a part of journalists' working routines in countries such as Canada and Australia, being women journalists disproportionately harassed. Italy features as the first country in Europe where journalist safety is threatened by online harassment, personal assaults, but most of all intimidation, often connected to reporting on organized crime, neo-fascist groups, and mafia issues. And about 20 journalists are living 24/7 with police protection in the country. Next slide, please. Thank you. This slide shows how countries stand in relation to indicators assessment criteria. Here I would like to call attention to specific countries. For instance, in the UK, some leading news media organizations have implemented detailed guidelines for journalists and editors in event of harassment, as well as procedures, representative measures, privacy protection, blocking policies, and threat reporting mechanisms. However, freelance journalists, an increasing proportion of the workforce are left on their own and have no access to support networks and mechanisms. Because of that, the UK scored 2 in this indicator. Some leading news media organizations also in the UK offer psychological support in trauma risk and health and mental training, which is also the case for leading news media organizations in countries such as South Korea and Belgium. There are nonetheless other countries whose leading news media organizations haven't implemented guidelines, but have rather adopted an ad hoc approach to help their journalists when they become targets of trolling and harassment. This is the case for some leading news media organizations in Iceland, Chile, Italy, Canada, and Hong Kong. There are other leading news media organizations that have special units to support the journalists, which is the case in case of harassment, which is the case for Germany and Sweden. The Swedish public service company Sveriges Television, sorry for the pronunciation, has a special cybersecurity team to address the issue. In the case of in the Netherlands, the support comes from collaboration between the Dutch Association of Journalists, the Association of Editors-in-Chief, the police, and the Public Prosecutor's Office. They launch a website, I can't pronounce the name, that translates to Press Safe in November 2019, as a contact point where journalists can report threats of all kinds related to violence. As you can see in the table, no countries scored 0. So next slide, please. Some final remarks. Online harassment, intimidation of women and ethnic minority journalists is an increasing problem in most MDM countries. This corresponds to previous findings, reports commissioned by the UNESCO and the International Women's Media Foundations that point out that violence against women journalists has become a frontline in journalism safety. And as Josef Trappel already mentioned, there is a lack of awareness and even acknowledgement of gender inequalities, power imbalances inside newsrooms and in the digital media environment. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Alice, for this presentation. So far, this is what we wanted to present ourselves here of the results. But of course, there's much more to tell, and I await your questions. And actually, we have already 2 questions in the Q&A from our audience. And I think, Josef, this first question is a question that should perhaps go to you in the first place, because it's about problematizing the notion of media concentration, or at least the way how in many indexes, as in ours, it's also being problematized. Ownership concentration is being regarded as a big risk. But why should it be regarded as a big risk? Perhaps maybe in smaller countries, it's a blessing because it keeps the media businesses viable. So I guess the question here is, at least in democratic societies, why should we worry all that much about ownership concentration? Because it enables news media to invest substantially in digitization and to make the business models work, to make them sustainable in the longer term. Josef, could you please reply to that question?
Sure. Thank you very much for this question of the anonymous participant, as it says here. Thank you. This is you're touching upon an epic question, an epic debate in communication studies, actually. And what we can see from the outset is that there are 2 different perspectives on it. Perspective 1 is the perspective of diversity. So the more media there are, the more views of the world there are. the more newsrooms there are, the more differently events, happenings, positions are reported to the public. So that's the position of diversity. On the other hand, there is the position which is more economic related, which says the smaller the media become, the weaker they get. So if they are small and poor, then they cannot defend themselves against lawsuits, for example. If then are lawyers who are contesting reporting, then small media become a problem. So in that sense, it is there are two perspectives, and I think what we know meanwhile, and after 20, 30, 40 years of research in media concentration, is that the second argument is the weaker one compared to the first argument, meaning that diversity is a precious good, in particular in countries where there are already few voices available only. Now, one can argue, and there are, as I said before, some notorious people who think that digitalization is going to solve the problem of media concentration because everybody can talk. And this is true. Everybody can express his or her opinion online, and they can argue and express what they think freely in mature democracies. Always remember that one. We tried to analyze this as well. And what we found is that the digital communication environment is not much different from the one before, meaning that we have strongly power-related agents in the digital environment. Often it's the same media who controlled before television, radio, newspapers, magazines. They now become strong in the digital environment as well. There are a few, in some countries, there are a few newcomers which are digital only, but they behave as the old oligopolies. So what we see is a reinforcement of concentration of power among these kind of organizations, irrespective whether they are analog or digital, actually. So what we see is a further threat, a further movement towards more media concentration. And we do consider this as a problem for democracy because it does affect diversity in a negative way. We have fewer voices, and the fewer voices we have, the more difficult it becomes to hold to hold those in power to account, for example. So it is true that we need strong media, but we need quite a number of them. So it would not help democracy if we have only very few, very strong media. This would lead to a situation where we have possibly more corruption, where we have possibly more intervolvement between powerful media and political power. And we have, if you think about some countries in the world, we can observe this very well. So if we have too few media which are too powerful, then they find themselves very much related to political power. And this really is a danger, and it's very difficult for democracy to sustain in such an environment.
Thank you, Josef. The next question comes from a colleague of ours at the Institute for Media Studies, Rosanne de Kock. She's a professor in journalism studies in our Brussels campus, actually at KU Leuven also. So her question is definitely for Jón, and it's about how the journalists and newsrooms deal with deep fake video material that might slip into their news items. And I might even add, how do they work with conspiracy theories, for instance, because that's a big issue also in all of the countries, actually, in our study. Conspiracists who reflect that fundamental distrust in the media. So how did you come across some solutions or some initiatives of different journalists and newsrooms in the interviews?
It's a great question. I wish I had a more detailed answer to it, but I'll do the best I can. So as mentioned, this is the first time that indicators are added on this. So I definitely am really interested in seeing how we can expand the research in this area moving forward. So as I mentioned in my presentation, there wasn't necessarily that much emphasis placed on other things rather than just doing your work as a journalist well and trying to sort of verify the sources that you see, sort of based on how you work as a journalist anyway. But in terms of looking at online content specifically, what we did find is often, particularly in relation to high stakes, elections and where there's a lot of kind of misinformation going around. What we did see in some newsrooms was these task forces and sort of small groups of journalists that would maybe go into a bit more detail in fact checking. And this was particularly also emphasized in bigger countries such as Germany that already had some sort of task forces in relation to investigative journalism, even before sort of the online environment changed the way it did. But I mean, in terms of, for example, here in Iceland, the journalist just simply said that you can just go to the source and check to see if they did, say what is in this video or not. So they would just say, go to the source, see what they say. But so there wasn't really that much focus on technology or sort of trying to help using technology to see if there was a fake or not, but there was a lot of curiosity about that technology. So I definitely think moving forward that journalists will be more maybe interested in using that also when this technology of deepfakes develops further. But just 2 points also that we did find in relation to sort of updating the traditional journalistic skills towards the digital era. Again, what was very often mentioned was the time pressure factor, and then also age, that sort of the older journalists were often more reluctant to embrace new ways to deal with the digital era, whilst maybe the younger journalists are more eager to get involved. So we don't really have that much data, particularly on the deepfake aspect, but I definitely think moving forward, it would be interesting to do more research on that.
Jón, I think you already entered a little bit into the answer of the question of our third person in the audience, Elodie Kona, and she's actually a master student in communication science, and she works on the MDM data. And she asked this question about, isn't it about time that the European media companies the newsrooms embrace this trend in the current digital environment? And you already said, yeah, it has to do with age, so maybe the younger generation is doing that already. And perhaps what about the findings in newsrooms where they seek the help of external experts or NGOs that are specializing in open source intelligence or other digital methods? Could you tell us a bit about that? And I open up the question to anybody else of the panelists who could remember some elements of an answer in the interviews they did.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, definitely what we did sort of find when we were writing this up is that the main there's a lot of sort of curiosity about this and ideas about how you expand going forward, but actually sort of concrete stuff that's going on in the newsrooms is more focused on these sort of smaller task forces of journalists doing the fact checking. So there's a lot of external fact checking going on, but not necessarily within the actual newsrooms. So that's maybe something that we need to look into, sort of how that develops moving forward. Yeah.
Anybody else who wants to add something from the interviews he or she did in the countries? Maybe, if not now, maybe a little later in the debate. no hand risen. I have a question actually on the investigative journalism topic. It was mentioned a number of times that, investigative journalism is important. It's criteria for quality. It's also the canary in the coal mine, so to speak, because it's a barometer of the health of the journalistic infrastructure in the country. So maybe a question for Hanne. You did the Dutch interviews. What do you think about the subsidies? What do you think about the schemes to help investigative journalism in the Netherlands?
Yeah, of course, an interesting question. First of all, investigative journalism is a heart of the journalism in democracy. And I remembered one of the Dutch interviewees also stated that, why are you asking questions about investigative journalism? That's what we all do. It's every single news item or article should be checked or investigated. It's related with what John talked about, misinformation. You feel that journalists are really thinking that that's the core of their business, and I totally agree, of course, with that. And I think there is also room for the press agencies there, that they are taking more effort, perhaps, to check news before they are launching it and because it's oftenly reused, as we all know. As press freedom is so highly valued, I think we need to be cautious to say structural financing is a good idea or something like that, because quota, for instance, it can be preferable in a theoretical lens, but journalists are really underlined the importance of the press freedom, especially the Dutch ones. For instance, follow the money, we are independent, and that's the crucial part of their identity. I think one option maybe is the public service broadcasters making more aware of their task and then making reliance with other media, commercial partners. And you see that also all in the Netherlands. You see that, for instance, Investico is working with Argos, with NPO in greater stories to investigate stories like I cannot remember an example anymore, but I know there was one, but I cannot come up right now. But they are working together on a structural basis, Investico and NPO, for instance. And I do believe that national and international collaborations are very crucial in this digital era.
Mm-hmm.
But subsidies, it's a good idea. I think in the Netherlands, you can see that it works very well. It's a vital source of income, for instance, for Investico that I already mentioned, also for Versbeton, a smaller hyper-local medium. Mm-hmm. But I don't believe that larger news media are in need of money, government money. They are large enough and they are big enough to handle it. But it's a good way, the subsidies, to keep awareness on the importance of what is the pure watchdog function of journalism, to end my answer on this question.
Thank you, Hanne. Yeah, I think it's very important also to work together for journalists, a bit like scholars do, actually, researchers do, and it's a pity for that. That, for instance, in the Netherlands or in Belgium, the conversation never took off. Although the fund, I remember that the Dutch fund gave money for that, actually 100,000 euro, and they had to give it back because it never was established. We tried also in Flanders, but it didn't work. Although I think there's still, that would be a good idea.
I only remember for the Panama Papers that there was an international collaboration. That's only one of the few examples, indeed.
Mm-hmm. Another thing, of course, another aspect which is very important is the independence of journalists, the firewalls between politics and journalists. And maybe I look at Christian, because he's confirming what I was just saying. So what do you think, Christian, about the situation, for instance, in your own country, Italy? Are the editors-in-chief and the journalists, are they being called by dissatisfied or angry politicians still? Is there still a telephone culture, or are these realities of the past?
Well, especially in the case of Italy, one thing that is very alive is the telephone culture, as you mentioned. So the first way to have confirmation of a news is not so much to go deep on different sources, but to call directly the press office of the political party or the politician himself, or to follow him on the social, and to how to say it, mix these sources that are in the same way auto-produced by politicians. Now, the question about how independent can the media be from the political power can find an answer, I think, in two indicators of our research, that are those about company rules, about external influences in the newsroom. So one indicator having to do with the freedom dimension, and the other in the real indicator about control, that is independence of the news media from power holders. Looking at our data, what we can find is two things. On the one side, among these countries that denounce some from the data or from the interviews, the high presence of politics or economics in the journalistic work, politics and economics are half and half a problem. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 cases, and there is one more about economics, but the problem is at the same time about the economical power and the political powers. Now, what we can do, trying to answer to one of the questions, is not measure completely media autonomy, but to see how much in the light of classical theories, the distance between journalists and the power known as the political and economical power can be. And this distance, we can say, is in the greater part of the countries, I can say, respected. They are at 1.5 meters. They cannot use the mask to speak one to each other. But in some countries, in something like 1/3 of the countries of our sample, that are the southern countries especially, it is still a problem, and it's something we have to understand more deeply, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Actually, there's one question in the chat. I don't know whether you saw it, by Gerardo de la Fuente Lora. How can you measure the media autonomy in front of the de facto powers in society? Is there anybody who could have a hand? I see a hand from Jon.
Yeah, I actually just wanted to add a few points I can maybe segue into this as well in what
Good.
people have been talking about in relation to the small state element. So
Okay.
both in terms of structure and culture. And I think it's great that, you know, a country like Iceland is included here, because very often we ignore small countries in research like this, but both in terms of the investigative journalism that was discussed earlier, for Icelandic media outlets, because they're so small, it's crucial to work together. And I mean, we saw that, for example, in relation to the Panama Papers here, how that was very, very important. And also in relation to the relationship between politicians and journalists, the small element is also a cultural one, because you might, you know, there's a professional relationship, but there's also a personal one. And that, you know, it adds another dimension in terms of the autonomy. So you know, you might want to be hard on someone, but then you might meet them at like some family gathering the next weekend and so forth, and that adds an element to this. And then I forgot to discuss the conspiracy theory aspect. One crucial point that I wanted to mention in relation to fact checking, because you asked me about the conspiracy theories, because one of the things, and because we have a lot of journalists here, one of the things that people are struggling with is, should the media cover the conspiracy theories and debunk them? Because what you might also end up happening is that you are actually disseminating the conspiracy theory more. So a lot of people might not actually have heard the conspiracy theory, but then they hear about it on the news when the journalist is debunking it. But at the same time, it might actually give it more wings, so to speak. So there's a big discussion going on. Should you cover and debunk or ignore? So that's a crucial point that we discussed in our findings as well.
Josef.
Yeah, well, more to the point on Gerardo's questions here. Well, there is, if you're asking, and I'll just repeat that for everybody, how can you measure the media autonomy in front of the de facto powers in society? Yes, indeed, this is tricky. Well, but there is, you simply ask those who must know, and these are journalists. So they feel whether they are under pressure, whether they can act freely or not, and they have a very good sensors for these kind of pressures which are built up somewhere. So you can ask them. But what you can also see here is that our instrument is a qualitative instrument. We cannot really say, okay, the pressure coming from the powerful is 74.7. That doesn't make much sense. But what we can say is that in some countries it's more it's more expressed than in others. Because journalists all over the place, including editors-in-chief, realize that they have a problem because of the powerful putting some pressure on them. So asking those who are concerned, I think, is the best way. And yes, of course, it's a qualitative measurement, and we try to keep to that principle and design our instrument that way that we can make statements on different countries in comparison, but it's not a measurement in the strict sense of the term.
Thales?
Yeah, only to add up to this, we had 3 very specific questions for this to journalists and editors-in-chief and so on. How separate the newsroom was from management and from sales department. This was one of the questions. To what extent is a media outlet dependent on a single sponsor or advertiser, or few of them? So in other words, whether media outlets are independent from revenue sources. And the third point, which people are in the board of a media outlet. So are there large organizations? Are there political parties, government, church institutions, for example, in the board of news media? So these 3 specific aspects, they have been asked and measured and help us kind of to assess media autonomy.
Thank you for expliciting this. There's another question maybe that I could ask Josef about: why did we include Hong Kong and South Korea? That, I think, is the last question we could ask, and then in the interest of time we have to finish this seminar. But of course we can always reply to the questions, and please send us your feedback on the findings at any time. But why Hong Kong and South Korea?
Good point. Well, first of all, we wanted to extend the instrument to Asia. And we wanted to have countries which are, to some extent, comparable to European countries. So India, for example, we thought is too complicated, simply. It is so diverse, and India itself is divided into so many languages and so many cultures. So we were a bit afraid of including a country like India. So that brought us back to countries of similar size as the European countries. And as Leen mentioned at the very beginning, we focus on countries with a democratic tradition. Now, if you then look at Asia, you will find yourself being trapped in a situation where there's not so much choice, actually. There are some developing countries which are on the way to democratization, and there are some countries which are democratic, in fact. And that's one aspect of this selection. The second aspect is we needed to have teams there interested and willing to work on this. So finally, we decided to have South Korea and Hong Kong. And the decision on Hong Kong was taken in 2019, at a time when the new legislation has not yet been passed, at the time when there was public protest against autocratic regime tendencies in Hong Kong. And we actually went to Hong Kong before we invited the team there, and we asked them whether they consider that the media can behave freely there. And the answer was clearly yes. So at the time when we decided media themselves could develop as they wish. So there was no constraint or very little constraint by the government. And this made us decide that Hong Kong is an interesting example, not knowing that within 2 years, the things are going to be changed. So what we have here is a country which reported the status ante. In that sense, I'm very happy that we have Hong Kong, but indeed, today it would be much more difficult to have Hong Kong in this election.
Thank you very much, Josef. So yeah, when I look at the clock, we're nearing the end of our webinar. I know for online meetings, time is essential. So we have to stick to our 1 hour, 15 minutes format. And it's clear that our Media for Democracy monitor showed that also in times of digital transition, or even in times of digital transition, journalism continues to fully play its democratic role, even given the areas of concern that we tapped into this afternoon. Our interviews revealed a great deal of confidence among the journalists, confidence in their watchdog role, although we see that the job situation becomes more precarious, so there's a tension there. Yet there are reasons also in healthy democracies for vigilance. For example, there is the ever-increasing media concentration, but we talked about this area of concern, which can lead to, as was said, a reduction on the diversity of voices, a reduction on the diversity of the supply. Gender inequality remains a pain point everywhere in all of the countries under study. And journalism jobs have become more and more precarious, as said, financially insecure, although very demanding, very intense, but also unstable and insecure. So that's really a pain point, especially for the younger generations, the younger journalists working in digital journalism environments. Looking then at Central Eastern Europe, which we haven't covered at all in the Media for Democracy monitor, the situation of media freedom and pluralism looks a lot grimmer when it comes to executing that, fulfilling that watchdog function. And a recent hot debate among the European Parliament members showed us that not only there are growing concerns about media freedom and pluralism in countries such as Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, Slovenia, there are also political divisions and opposed views on where exactly the problem is, or what exactly the problem is, even among the members of parliament, of course. It's not a homogeneous crowd. So, needless to say, the European Commission needs to move to action, widening its toolbox that it has to support media freedom with financial means, with regulation, with enforcement actions. And therefore, it's going to be very important to follow up what's happening in Europe, for instance, in the coming months. And that's why, and I hardly dare saying it, but we plan another seminar, a live seminar this time, a physical meeting in Brussels as a follow-up of this webinar on November the 18th. So On November the 18th in Brussels, we will pay attention to the new EU legislation underway on topics that deal with regulatory approaches towards the big tech companies. We'll also probably hear more about how will we deal with harmful content. Will there be any legal takedowns, or is that maybe also problematic for freedom of expression? So in any case, we hope to see some of you really in our next event in Brussels. And please, of course, take a close look at our findings. And also later on in the books that are coming out, the Nordicum books, the 2 books are almost ready. And the 3rd thematic book will be ready by the end of the year for sure. Thank you for this debate. Thank you for listening to us. Thank you to the panelists. And thank you everybody for being with us. Josef, you still have the floor.
Yes, thank you. Before you close, Leen, I just received an email from Democracy. I would like to read that out to you. And the email says, from Democracy, it says, loud and clear, media policy, act now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, have a good day. Bye-bye.